As we said, this session is going to be in English, so if you like to get your headsets for translation, please go ahead. You can get them outside the hall. The late we are, lunch will be late as well, so please let's start. Okay, I welcome all of you. Welcome again at this session, which is numbered the session before lunch. So I would like to welcome two distinguished ladies, Nivedita Manon, professor at the Comparative Politics Institute and at the Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi. And she's going to talk about after the head cover, and then we're going to listen to Ms. Shireen Saiqali, a member of the staff at the American University in Cairo. She's going to talk about the freedom in the time of revolution. Now with Nivedita, after the head cover, woman criticism and the process of cultural control. Now, and then Shireen will talk about freedom in the time of revolution. Please, Nivedita.
Thank you very much, Muwatin, and the Ibrahim Abulugod Institute of Birzeit University for giving us this opportunity to be here in Palestine. We bring you greetings from the Indian campaign for the academic and cultural boycott of Israel. I'm also very thrilled by the wonderful coincidence that my interpreter, Mr. Meher, has studied for 6 years in India, in the state in which I was born. I feel that the universe is sending us a sign, reminding us about the long and powerful historical bonds between India and Palestine. Azad Philistine Zindabad. Long live free Palestine. In my paper today, I will bring before you some important issues around the politics of sexuality that the women's movement in India has been dealing with for the past 2 decades. A little earlier, Lisa Taraki asked me, "Are you going to scandalize us today?" Maybe I will. But all I'm doing is to bring before you very live and very significant issues being discussed and debated in Indian democracy today. Feminists of South and West Asia share a certain political terrain, marked by community and nation on the one hand, and imperialist domination and hegemonic Western values on the other. We need to develop a third space for a radical politics of culture, one that will critique both kinds of cultural policing, the coercion of the right wing, as well as the hegemony of the so-called free Western world. It is by now a phenomenon well recorded by feminist scholarship and politics that communities vest their honor in their women, and that cultural policing begins with marking and then drawing women inside the community. Particularly when a community feels its identity or existence is under threat, then the proud assertion of its identity is always marked on the bodies of its women first. For instance, the increasing numbers of Muslim women wearing the burqa, which is the Indian form of the hijab, in the state of Kerala, where this practice was rare, is often dated from the demolition of the Babri Masjid by Hindu right-wing forces in 1992. This phenomenon is not restricted to minority communities alone. Majority communities too respond to the threat of Western culture in this way, as is evident from violent reactions to, for example, the holding of Miss World contest in India from the Hindu right and in Nigeria from the Muslim right. So it's not only minority communities that do this kind of policing. Of course, we have a feminist critique of beauty contests because of the way they commodify the female body, but feminist protests have never succeeded in closing down such events. There is a peculiarity to this moment in history, particularly when one is located in a post-colonial democracy like India. In the face of a renewed and relentless moral rhetoric through the 90s from the right, which targets women as the repositories of cultural purity, one kind of critical response has been from the globalized elite, celebrating choice, individual freedom, and women's right to their bodies. Feminist responses to issues in this context find themselves negotiating unimagined minefields, but also finding subversive potential in unexpected domains. For instance, take Valentine's Day, which supposedly celebrates romance, very well known in the West. In India, Valentine's Day has become very popular since the 1990s. Advertising around the date is saturated with commodified romance. As feminists, when the phenomenon began to manifest itself in the liberalizing 1990s, in the neoliberal restructuring 1990s, we feminists read it critically as exemplifying the new consumerism. Because of course, it's not enough to love someone on Valentine's Day, you have to buy something to prove it. But very soon, the Hindu right began to attack it as dangerous to Indian values, and the attacks included physical attacks on courting couples in public. This attack on Valentine's Day coincides also with a phase of increasing instances of families violently separating couples who choose to marry outside their caste or religious community, often killing one or both of them, what are called honor killings by the English media, but in India, feminists have started using the term custodial deaths, because these are deaths in custody of children by their family. So we find these increasing instances of these kinds of killings, as well as what have come to be called lesbian suicides. That is, women who commit suicide, leaving letters explicitly saying they love a woman, but their families are forcing one or both of them to get married traditionally. When this happened, when Valentine's Day began to be attacked by the Hindu right wing, and when we realized that it coincided with these kinds of increasing attacks on young couples refusing to follow the rules of love, we began to realize that as feminists, what it is about Valentine's Day that was dangerous to conservative right-wing forces. That is the subversive potential of love. Love that refuses to be tamed within the rules of caste, community, and heterosexuality. In the rest of the presentation then, I will discuss three specific themes related to sexuality and the paradoxes, because clearly this is a paradox. We find ourselves defending Valentine's Day, which is for us, which is a simple, consumerist, commercial exploitation of some human emotion, as we see in many, many contexts. But we found that Valentine's Day has subversive potential, and if the Hindu right wing hates it so much, then feminists should recognize that there is something dangerous in it to conservative values, and this is the kind of paradox that I'm talking about. So I will discuss three specific themes related to sexuality and feminist politics, but which has relevance for democratic politics in general in India today. The first theme has to do with queer politics. Now, the term queer is taken, of course, straight from English, and in English, literally, it means strange or odd, but it has, as we know, become a political term that refers to a politics that challenges the idea that love and desire only exist naturally between people of what are called opposite sexes, and what in English is called heterosexuality. All challenge to heterosexuality as natural and normal is queer. Increasingly, we have begun to use the term queer without translation in Indian languages too now. There are words in Indian languages for homosexual practices, but queer is a particular political term that we deliberately do not translate because it has a very specific meaning. So you will find the word queer pronounced in all the different Indian languages differently, but it means something. Now, when did queer politics erupt in India? The question that was repeatedly raised by dominant sections of the women's movement in India from the late 90s onwards, when this issue began to become prominent, the question that was raised is that homosexuality is not relevant for feminism. Same-sex desire is a Western aberration, an elitist issue. The opposite voice within the movement argued that at the most basic level, it is a matter of citizenship rights of large numbers of Indians who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgendered. But more importantly, the sexuality movements are increasingly raising more difficult questions about the assumed naturalness of the heterosexual patriarchal family, which is the source and site of oppression of both women as well as of men who do not conform to patriarchal standards of power and personhood. The heterosexual patriarchal family, as left-oriented feminists we have come to realize, this family is the basis of inequitable property relations in society, inequitable not only between men and women, but also because it deprives the vast majority of society from access to resources that are privatized inside the family. This family is also the basis of repressive caste and community identity. Any challenge to such family arrangements and the possibility of rethinking new forms of intimacy and support, we gradually began to realize should be welcomed by feminists. The point is that once we give up on the idea that only heterosexuality is normal and that all human bodies are clearly, naturally, either male or female, more and more kinds of bodies and desires will come into view. Perhaps also one body may, in one lifetime, move through many identities and desires. The use of queer, then, is a deliberate political move which underscores the fluidity, potential and actual, of sexual identity and sexual desire. From the 1990s in India, there came to be visible a range of political assertions that implicitly or explicitly challenged heteronormativity and the institution of monogamous patriarchal marriage. Such challenges are seen around the demand for the repeal of Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code, which criminalizes, I quote, carnal acts against the order of nature, unquote. It's important to remember that Section 377 of the IPC does not reflect ancient Indian civilization, but was introduced in the 19th century by the British colonial government. Various kinds of political action around issues related to the lives and civil liberties of traditional communities of eunuchs in India who are called hijras, gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgendered people and sex workers. These lives, these practices have much longer history as in India, longer histories going back to centuries, as scholars have shown, but it is in the 1990s that they came to be visible in public. Why the 1990s? One of the reasons for the possibility of talking about sexuality had to do with growing awareness about AIDS epidemic, which made it increasingly legitimate to talk of sex outside the realms of law, demography, and medicine, or to talk about sex not only as violence against women or in terms of population control. So this was one of the reasons. International funding for HIV/AIDS prevention played a significant role in the creation of new NGOs dealing with sexuality. But the point is that although the beginning of this ability to speak about sexuality is arising from the naming of a disease, and it is thoroughly NGOized to begin with, once such programs were started, it opened up the floodgates for political articulation of non-normative sexualities. And the point is that once such issues enter the public realm, the effects are uncontrollable and spill over into forms of radicalization that the state or funders could not have predicted or desired. The whole unpredictable thing about politics is that often counter-hegemonic voices are able to tip the scales within a constellation produced by a heterogeneous range of ideas and circumstances. Thus, by 1998, when Deepa Mehta's film Fire, depicting a sexual affair between sisters-in-law in a traditional Hindu household was attacked violently by the Hindu right, there was a sufficiently self-aware community for the attack to act as a catalyst for public demonstrations in defense of freedom of expression and against homophobia on the streets not only of big cities like Mumbai and Delhi, but in many other small towns of a size and visibility unknown before in India. These demonstrations brought together opponents of the Hindu right, defenders of freedom of expression, human rights activists, and gay and lesbian activists. Of course, many or all of these categories overlapped. It is significant that movements in India challenging heterosexuality as natural and normal turned to the women's movement as a natural ally. In the 1980s, the initial response of the established leadership of the women's movement was entirely homophobic, denouncing homosexuality as unnatural, Western aberration, and an elitist preoccupation. Even today, the alliance is not an unproblematic one, but in the 2 decades since then, we have had a long process of dialogue, negotiation, conversation among one another, and there have been significant shifts. Openly homophobic arguments are almost never made publicly anymore within the women's movement. The important thing about the term queer or the politics of queer in India is that it has always gone beyond sexuality. Queer politics speaks of sexuality as a politics intrinsically and inevitably connected with the politics of class, gender, caste, religion, and so on, thereby both acknowledging other movements and as well as demanding inclusion within them. One of the most important, I must speak more slowly. One of the most important developments recently was a judgment by the Delhi High Court in 2009, which reinterpreted Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code to exclude consensual sex among adults. In other words, this extremely important judgment decriminalized sex of the same sex between consenting adults. Adults of the same sex are no longer criminals if they, with mutual consent, have sexual intercourse with one another. This is a very huge development. Although the court intervention was initiated by an NGO working within the potentially depoliticizing framework of AIDS prevention, once the issue reached court, a number of other more political groups also entered the process, a broad coalition of feminists, democratic rights, and queer activists. Thus, the judgment that resulted, in a sense, reflects the radical transformation in common sense brought about by over a decade of queer and feminist politics. Because the judgment anchors the right of same-sex adults to the fundamental rights granted by the Constitution. And the judges held that Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code violates articles to life, freedom, and so on, which are guaranteed by the Constitution. Several right-wing groups have appealed this judgment in the Supreme Court, where it is pending, but interventions supporting the judgment have also reached the Supreme Court from parents, psychiatrists, and several teachers, including Aditya Nigam and myself. The judgment has given an unprecedented legitimacy to queer identity in ways that far exceed any limited notion of civil rights of homosexual people. In fact, several legal commentators have pointed out that the Delhi High Court's interpretation of the anti-discrimination provisions of Article 15 could potentially benefit other discriminated groups, such as disabled people, religious minorities, and so on. What is interesting is the general approval for the judgment, even in the mainstream, an indicator of the successful shifts in common sense effected by over a decade of queer feminist interventions at every level. Of course, now that Section 377 is on its way out, the differences within the movement will become more visible, because there are those who are content to be gay or lesbian without fear of being arrested, but who don't want to be political at all. There are queer politically aware people who may be Hindu right-wing or pro-capitalist or anti-affirmative action. And of course, there could be a queer politics that is opposed to all of this. This is the moment of coming of age of queer politics when it encounters the difficult recognition feminism has only recently come to terms with. Not all non-heterosexual people are queer, just as not all women are feminist. and not all queer people, nor all politically active women, are left-oriented or secular. For example, feminist and queer movements in India are very critical of what has come to be called pinkwashing by Israel, its presentation of itself as the only state in the region that protects gay rights. Most sections of queer and feminist movements in India are pro-Palestine and anti-Zionist, and we are quite aware and quite alert to what is going on. So this is not a kind of naive understanding that queer politics is somehow progressive in itself. There are different strands to queer politics, just as there are different strands to feminist politics. I think the point, the kind of really challenging point that queer politics forces us to confront is that if we recognize that what we think of as normal heterosexuality is actually painfully constructed and kept in place by a range of cultural, biomedical, and economic controls, and that these controls help to sustain existing hierarchies of caste and gender, then we would have to accept that all of us are or have the potential to be queer. This was one theme that I wanted to talk about. The second theme, now these are themes that are debated, these are not easily accepted, but these are very visible, and these are themes that the women's movement and Indian democracy in general has to face. So these are debated. The position I'm putting forward is not an unquestioned, acceptable, easy position, but this position cannot be challenged very easily either. So I wanted to put before you the idea that these arguments are being debated right now, and they're very live, and they're very political issues. So the second theme is the very powerful and visible sex workers' movements. Feminism has for long seen prostitution as violence against women, and many Indian feminists still do. However, a new understanding of the practice has emerged within the women's movement as a result of the pressure from the politicization of people who engage in prostitution and their voice becoming increasingly public. One of the healthiest things about the women's movement in India, we have all kinds of problems, but one of the most healthy things about the women's movement in India is that we prioritize democracy above all else. When we see that, and when we are faced with powerful democratic voices, when we see powerful democratic mobilizations, we have to rethink our old ideas. So when we are faced with well-organized sex workers' movements, militantly posing certain questions to the women's movement, we sit up and we take notice, and we start talking to one another. One of the key transformations that has come about because of these sex workers' movements is precisely the emergence of the term sex work to replace prostitution. The understanding behind this is that we need to demystify sex. It is only the mystification of sex by both patriarchal discourses and feminists that makes sex work somehow appear to be a fate worse than death. The first pan-India survey of sex workers was recently conducted about a year ago. 3,000 sex workers from outside collectivized or organized spaces, therefore, so these are just ordinary sex workers who are not unionized. And the significant finding was this: about 71% of them said that they entered the profession willingly. Now, what does this mean? What is the question of choice here? This study establishes what feminist research on sex work has been tending increasingly to show, that the model of choice versus force is utterly inadequate in understanding the motivations of, in fact, most of people, but especially of women in sex work. Poverty and limited education are conditions that push women into labor markets at early ages, and sex work was found to be one among several options available to women in the labor market. And what they found, what this survey found, is that women tried other occupations, but they found they had to either supplement their income from sex work, or they simply found sex work to be an economically attractive option. What this study does is force us to recognize that choice is severely limited in the capitalist labor market as a whole. If people find it possible to move to work that is less exhausting and better paying, they will do so. There is no more or less agency exercised in choosing to work as a domestic servant in multiple households for a pittance and with minimum dignity, or to be exploited by contractors in arduous construction work, than there is in choosing to do sex work. When it comes to other kinds of work, demeaning work like domestic labor or exhausting and exploited conditions of work in factories, we see that people do this work only because they have no other choice. But our reaction would not be to demand abolition of that form of work. Rather, we would want that the conditions of all kinds of work should be dignified and that there should be minimum wage regulations, reasonable leisure time, and so on. The choice to do sex work is no more or less constrained than any choice of work is under capitalism. Then there is the fact that sex workers often face rape and physical abuse and so on, and what our argument would be is that decriminalization of sex work would enable such women to take these matters to the law, just like any other raped woman or person of any gender, for that matter. For most women, isn't marriage far more of a compulsory institution and compulsory form of work than any other? It is for many women as arduous, undignified, and inescapable as sex work is assumed to be, and unpaid on top of it all. But we try to empower women within marriages, not demand the abolition of marriage itself. We might want to consider that, though. The growing sex workers movement in India thus provokes us into questioning the assumption that it is better to be one man's wife, effectively subject to feudal power relations, than a sex worker subject to a capitalist contract. An alternative way in which organized sex workers conceptualize their work is to move away from the idea of being even a worker to a person running her own business. So we increasingly find that some organizations use the term people in prostitution and sex work to organize, to acknowledge the diverse groups covered under this term, and to make this point that there are multiple identities that people have. When she's with a client, she may be a sex worker, but when she's with her children, she's a mother. When she's educating her community, she is a peer educator. So this is the second theme, the sex workers movement, which forces feminists to actually confront many of the arguments that we have ourselves made about family and patriarchy. And the final theme I have called the veil and the miniskirt. The projection of Islam as uniquely regressive with regard to women is a globally prevalent notion. And of course, this is the case in India too. In India, this notion is manifested in debates over religion-based family laws, or the debate over what we call the Uniform Civil Code. And these debates, I won't go into these debates, but in India, the argument that is made by the Hindu right wing is that the Muslim community is somehow particularly regressive and particularly exploitative of its women. And what the women's movement keeps pointing out is that all religious laws discriminate against women, Hindu, Muslim, or Christian. But I won't go into that. What I do want to point out is that we have been debating these issues in India, particularly in the context of the ban on the headscarf and different forms of the veil in Europe. We recognize that this has become the emotive symbol by which the West can assert its modernity and the freedom available to its citizens and so on. But of course, what we have increasingly come to feel in India, the women's movement, is that if it is individual freedom at stake, then European countries should be ensuring that Muslim women forced to wear the veil by their families have access to secular laws that can protect them. But laws banning the headscarf or veil, rather than empowering Muslim women, in fact attack the freedom of those Muslim women who choose to wear them as an integral part of their religious observance. We see these attempts by European governments to selectively restrict religious observance as being exactly parallel to and on par with Islamic attempts to impose the veil on Muslim societies in which the veil did not exist. In both cases, patriarchal power is being directed towards shaping women's identity and behavior, using them instrumentally as a means towards ends that marginalize them. Of course, there is also fierce internal resistance from Muslim women and men to Islamic forces imposing specific readings of Islam and the Quran, but their resistance is weakened, not strengthened, by restricting freedom of religion for Muslims. In India, too, there are internal voices in the Muslim community that raise objections to religious patriarchies. For instance, the fatwas of Darul Uloom Deoband and other patriarchal seminaries against freedom for women are attacked publicly by Zakia Soman, who says she is a Muslim and a feminist. She's one of the founding members of Bharatiya Muslim Mahila Andolan, which is an Indian Muslim women's movement, And she declares that we work under the framework of Islamic principles and the Indian Constitution. But every Hindu right-wing attack on minorities and every attempt to push through a uniform civil code makes Zakia Soman's task all the more difficult. So much for the veil. But what about the miniskirt, that symbol of liberation? The point that many feminists disturbed by the bans have noted, including Western feminists, is that the freedom to dress in revealing clothes is equally located within a sexist culture, one ruled by the market, for only a particular kind of body is permitted to be revealed. It's important to recognize that the feminist critique is of the cultural pressure to dress in particular ways, whether this involves showing more skin or covering up. In either case, the element of force is what we isolate as the problem, not the dress itself. For instance, in 2011, the Badminton World Federation announced its new dress code requiring women players to wear skirts, I quote, to ensure attractive presentation of badminton, unquote. Now, this is important in India because the number of women, number of Indian women badminton players do well internationally. So badminton is something that we take very seriously. Now, of course, most workplaces have dress codes, but the problem here is the blatant sexism of the requirement. For what the Badminton World Federation was saying quite openly was that they expected more people to come to see the sport if they could expect to see suggestively flying skirts on women. There were protests from all the top women players of India on grounds of comfort while playing and personal preference. Chinese players too raised objections, saying things like, I don't feel comfortable wearing skirts. When I wear a skirt, I don't know how to play. Or they said that skirts hampered their movement when they played. But of course, what was interesting, so these women, all these women made professional arguments against changing their attire, but religious objections predictably made their appearance. Badminton Asia Confederation Vice President Syed Naki Mohsin said that the rule would be discriminatory, not to women, as feminists might feel, but to Muslims. He said, the BWF states that the new regulation will not discriminate against any religion or beliefs. How can wearing skirts not clash with the religious beliefs of female Muslim players? Eventually, the Badminton World Federation backed off, but what we found disturbing was the foregrounding of quote-unquote religious and quote-unquote Muslim objections by the media over the completely non-religious and profession-related objections made by women players. One wonders if Muslim objections had not kicked in, whether the opinion of women players would have counted at all. Let me conclude by suggesting that politics around sexuality offers feminist politics the potential to subvert both nation and capital. The heterosexual patriarchal family as the cornerstone of the nation, this is the arrangement that has successfully normalized unjust and unequal forms of identification, property ownership, and access to resources. The story of the nation state from the 18th century onwards has been told as a heroic saga of struggle against tyranny and expanding frontiers of citizenship. That narrative renders unthinkable the closures, the fractures, the marginalizations, the silencings that are constitutive of the identity of citizen. Indeed, the nation can only represent dominant majoritarian values. Minorities asserting their culture can never claim the legitimacy of representing the nation, whether it be Muslims in India or Indians in the US. Further, the secular nation too has constituted the citizen through equally anti-democratic measures. No project of nationalism is ever completed. It is frozen at some point or the other through a coercive apparatus backed by the sanction of violence that prevents the further articulation of other voices and identities with similar aspirations. Any radical transformative politics today, therefore, must be post-national. Here, the post of post-nationalism is to be understood not in the sense of after, but in the sense of having passed through the nation. When I use the term post-national, therefore, I'm suggesting that there have been a number of ways in which the term post-national has been used, but I'm suggesting we need to move away from what I call arguments for post-nationalism from above, made by two opposed positions. One in which the sovereignty of the nation, which is the neoliberal project, in which the sovereignty of the nation sought to be bypassed in the interests of global capital. But equally, there is a kind of post-Enlightenment Habermasian celebration of global universalism. So I'm not talking of post-nationalism from above. I'm talking about post-nationalism from below. Its politics can be represented by any idea that is counter-hegemonic, whether that hegemony refers to development, sexuality, caste, community, or any other. It has two dimensions. One, over the nation, cross-border solidarities, which are easier to understand. For example, Indian and Pakistani people-to-people conversations and resistance to both the policies of both states and opposition to the nuclear bombs of both states. But there's also post-nationalism under the nation, which resists inclusion into the larger national identity, insisting on space-time trajectories that do not mesh with progressivist dominant narratives of nation and history. It seems to me that this kind of post-nationalism, which implies a kind of autonomous local grounded politics, but which enter into solidarity with other kinds of politics of this sort, implies the simultaneous transformation through practices of everyday life of the place where you insist on staying. The potential of this is enormous, and the imaginative horizons are expansive. Thank you.
شكرا.
At that thin membrane, the hymen, narratives unfold and lives are determined.
Coming up
There,
while she
the
was speaking,
binaries
and
of
pen
the
was
clean and the
writing.
stained,
I
the
hope that
righteous
later
and the
you will
debauched,
be brief
the
in your
honorable and the
comments.
shamed flourish.
Now
There, the
we will
blurry
listen
border.
to Shireen Saiqali, who will speak about liberty in the times of revolution.
There, the blurry
There are
border
slides that she's
between the
going to
civilized
show.
and the backward, the liberated
Before
and the
I
oppressed,
start in
the
English, I would
East
like to
and the
thank
West
Muwatin,
pretend to lie.
and I hope
There, the claims to
that
flesh
your
as an
eyebrows will continue
evidentiary
to be
terrain
up.
stand.
And I'd
For the
also
last
like to
year and a
thank
half,
the
one
interpreter,
woman has
Jumana,
chipped away at this
who
edifice
happens to
erected
be
on
from
her hymen.
Beirut, the city I was born in.
The task
My
is larger than her.
presentation is
Yet whatever
a
its outcome,
narrative
her
of
battle
certain
bears the
shots
force
of
and the meaning
different
of liberty in
personalities
times of
that are familiar
revolution.
to you. And I would
Samira
concentrate
Ibrahim
particularly on Samira
understands
Ibrahim,
that
who is
politics
the
is all
revolutionary
about the
who
body.
fought against the
She is
so-called
not alone in this
virginity
realization. Indeed,
exam.
one opening salvo of the last 2 years of Arab uprising was the spectacle of burnt flesh. Muhammad Bouaziz's self-mutilation overturned authoritarian regimes' staging of the body as a place to produce their power. He turned his body into a surface of vigorous, if desperate, political revolt. It is a noteworthy disjuncture that in the visual landscape of the much-touted social media revolution of the last 2 years, it was images of pain and torture that inspired the most response. And most of us will remember this image in particular. Here, Ben Ali, surrounded by the obsequious remnants of his flailing regime, stood over Bouazizi, who, immersed in pain and teetering on the edges of death, emitted an unmistakable power. The dictator was desperate and afraid, and a little stunned that after 23 years he should have to pay regards to a vegetable seller. Both men's lives would change forever. Bouazizi died in a matter of days, and in less than 2 weeks, Ben Ali answered the Tunisians' call and fled. Those masses of bodies standing shoulder to shoulder on Habib Bourguiba Avenue unleashed an unprecedented sense of political possibility. Samira Ibrahim, like hundreds of thousands of her compatriots, would take their cue and begin the reclamation of Tahrir Square on 25 January 2011. They carried signs of the mangled image of Khalid Said, who some have credited as the face that sparked revolution. The summer of 2010, 2 officers arrested the young blogger in a cyber cafe. They smashed his head against a marble table. They dragged him outside, fractured his skull, dislocated his jaw, shattered his teeth, and broke his nose. He begged for mercy as fluid and blood poured out of his body, but the officers continued their mission apace. At the morgue, which over the last 2 years has become a site of morbid pilgrimage in Egypt, Khalid's brother photographed the brutalized corpse. The image went viral. It revealed the very public secret of torture. It showed the extent to which police brutality and judicial complicity had functioned to perfect torture as an art. It was this perfection that Samira and her compatriots confronted. The masses of bodies facing water tanks, tear gas, and bullets became a political symbol. Samira watched as some gave lives and others gave parts. On 28 January, Ahmed Harara lost one of his eyes in a pitched battle with the police. That day, Samira was arrested. It was not her first experience with the rituals of state power, and it would not be her last. Samira rejoiced along with millions when Mubarak's 30-year grip on Egypt was dislodged. But the revolution had cut authoritarianism only at its tip. The mutilation of the flesh had sown deep roots. And during their ostensibly transitional rule, the Supreme Council of Armed Forces would seek to further ensconce torture in their surveillance and what some have taken to calling their very occupation of Egyptian society. The day after International Women's Day, in March 2011, when a demonstration for gender equality turned ugly, Samira, along with hundreds, took to Tahrir Square once again. She was arrested once again. Dissidence and its costs were not new to her. She came from a line of Islamists who had paid very dearly for their opposition to Mubarak. In middle school, state security had interrogated her because she wrote an essay criticizing the rhetoric that celebrated Arab armies and their so-called brave confrontation of Israeli occupation. Arrest and interrogation had shaped her biography, but the trials in store were far beyond what these experiences could prepare her for. She, along with 17 other women, were handcuffed and dragged from Tahrir Square to the Cairo Museum. That vault of historical treasures spanning 4,000 years was now a space of coercion. Military officers beat, electrocuted, poured water on, and slapped the women's faces with their shoes. They orchestrated a portrait of incrimination, a theater of domination, as they coerced these revolutionaries to pose alongside Molotov cocktails, presenting them as government thugs and prostitutes, just as they told them, "You have ruined the country." These were the methods of the former regime. The SCAF aimed to take on the guardianship of a revolution they sought to destroy. Samira understood. They want us to regret defiance, to regret revolution. The women were held for several hours on a bus and later transported to a military prison. Worn down by beating, scarred by electrocution, tired and hungry, Samira spotted a freshly printed poster of the deposed president. "We love Mubarak," an officer explained. She and the other women were then ordered to form two lines based on a semantic binary: women without hymens and girls with hymens. The girls, Samira among them, were stripped and taken to a separate room in full view of tens of officers. They fed off her coerced visibility and recorded the events on their phones. The military physician, Ahmed Adel, dutifully medicalized rape and through a series of virginity tests. These women, SCAF would explain, were not like your daughters or mine, for they had camped out intense with male protesters. The army had to protect itself, one general explained. Quote, "We didn't want them to say we had sexually assaulted or raped them, so we wanted to prove that they weren't virgins in the first place." According to this tautology, Ahmed Adel punctured Samira's hymen to prove that it had not existed. For if it did not exist, and she was not a virgin, her rape would then be impossible. In effect, he raped her so that she could not claim that she was raped. But Samira resisted what was expected of her, to hide and cover herself in shame. She came forward, she detailed the brutalization, and she took the army to court. In her videotaped testimony, she reconstituted her mutilated flesh through language and memory. She began recovering her body as a political artifact. Samira would see victory and defeat. In December 2011, a civilian judge ruled the practice of virginity tests illegal. For many, that victory was a salve on the open wound of 2 months of brutalization. At Maspero on October 9, in continuity with the long-held state practice of inciting sectarianism, officers killed 26 protesters. They shot some point blank, and they ran over others with tanks. The flattened, dismembered, and disfigured bodies of these mostly young men were transformed into sectarian artifacts. Another young Egyptian, Mina Daniel, became yet another political symbol in the struggle against military brutality. This is an image of the mother of Mina Daniel and the mother of Khaled Said. The battles continued the following month as ultras, the young football fans some regard as the soldiers of revolution, and other young men stood on the front lines of Mohammed Mahmoud Street. Women in helmets ran back and forth with large trays supplying the men with rocks. That day, Ahmed Harara lost his second eye to the now infamous eye hunter, Mahmoud Subhi al-Shinnawi. Al-Shinnawi alone blinded 5 protesters, and he was actually caught on film being congratulated by his fellow officers for having such a good aim. But revolutionaries, and this is what's very interesting, revolutionaries transformed disfiguration into badges of political maturity. Eye patches became ubiquitous. Even the venerable lions of Qasr al-Nil Bridge donned them as symbols of the deformed but steadfast body. That same month, Egyptian forces stripped, dragged, and beat a revolutionary who chose on that fateful day to wear a blue bra. The brutality inspired a relentless flow of indictments that equated the theatrical beating with the denigration of the nation's honor. At the same time, right-wing and counter-revolutionary calls for a return to stability and normality targeted the political practices of women. Again, SCAF would insist these revolutionaries were not like our wives, our mothers, our sisters. Many women would respond in kind to this rhetoric, using the same tropes of decency and honor. These efforts culminated in a demonstration on December 20th that many claim was the largest women's demonstration Cairo had seen since 1919. Organizers and activists complained that the ring of men surrounding them caged and repressed them, just as they supposedly protected them. But on the walls of the city, the beaten revolutionary was reconfigured as Superwoman, raging against the military rule. In March 2012, a military tribunal tried the case of Ahmed Adel, the military doctor who had conducted the virginity tests. They acquitted him of rape, and they charged him instead with public indecency and disobeying military orders. The court further concluded that the virginity tests had never been conducted in the first place. That day of the virginity test was a day of coercive penetration for Samira. She called it the end of the revolution. When she faced mutilation, she wished for death, but her perseverance signals the beginning of a very dramatic change. Torture, mutilation, and death continue to be the inevitabilities of opposing authoritarianism. Activists, scholars, and politicians have been struggling to understand what is it driving Arabs from Tunis to Damascus to Qatif to take their lives in their hands and onto the streets. People had overcome the obstacle of fear, they concluded. But it is not just the fear of mutilation that revolutionaries overcome. It is also the fear of shame. In March 2012, Samira walked out of the military court. Her face, always framed by a colorful headscarf, usually exuded the kind of strength reserved only for the very brave. That day it was contorted in pain. A woman rushed to her, admonishing, "Don't cry, don't cry." Samira's followers understood the almost brutal plea, for her defeat would not be hers alone. Samira had become a tourist of state rationalities. She had gone from the military to the medical to the legal. She had completed what one scholar has called the itinerary of all the different and specialized things that repressive apparatus does to bodies. It was the final deformation of the court ruling that signaled the end of Samira's journey for reformation in the halls of the Egyptian state. That Egyptian state production of the body as a terrorized and passive political subject inspired people to take their lives in their hands and onto the streets. Even as the Mubarak regime fell, the military continued to use brutality and torture to mold male and female bodies. Their theatrics of domination reveal a deep and sinister hatred for the Egyptian people as a collective body and as individual bodies. Both men and women are subject to various types of brutality. The mundane, scripted as political, and the sexual, scripted as gendered. Samira Ibrahim did not fight her brutalization in the tired terms of honor and righteousness. She fought it on political grounds. She did not duck and cover. She did not claim the category of the virgin as a sacred space of refuge. She confronted the precipice at which her flesh and its openings had become the terrain of public scrutiny. And defying dissent, she decided instead to walk all over it. She did not respond to the categories of virgin, girl, woman. She was instead a revolutionary. Thank you.
Thank you, Shireen. As for the questions, let's do just like the session before to take cues. Please, I beg you to speak in very brief, please. If you please mention your name before you make your question. And once again, I beg you to speak in brief. Mr. Burhan Jarrar. I want to speak in brief about Navida Manon. She spoke about the development of Law 337. In fact, in our culture and in our Islamic culture, the marriage of homosexuals and allowing adultery is against morals, and And so we are no pigs. It's only pigs who are not jealous, who don't for their wives. So we protect our morals, and all these homosexuality and adultery are immoral, and they lead to AIDS and other. So the whole relation between man and woman. But the other things that we spoke about, scarf, why in France they prevent the scarf? It is a holy thing. Nuns in France don't go walk without scarves. Of course, we have. There are time-worn fallacies and habits that were given to Islam, but those who did not study Islam, they don't know what Islam is. And in 8 out of 12 cases, women get more rights than men. Women by us are sacrosanct. They are not just half the society; they are the whole society, and they get all their rights. Okay, my greetings. My name is Mohammed Nidal Darwazi. Question is to Nevita. Is the freedom of sexuality in the Indian culture, is it a popular culture? Is it the gate for all human freedoms in India? And the second question is the scarf among the Indian cultural tradition, or is it strange? In Quran and all Islamic, there is no clear text demanding the covering the head of the woman, but the dissemination of using this scarf is or stems from the Torah, and a researcher in Al Azhar got his PhD. Um, um, which says that scarf is not binding in Islam, or wearing a scarf is not binding. Mr. No, if you have a question, please, Dr. Shireen. There's no clear text that links honor to the Haman. This is a social thing in the Islamic societies, and the popular uprisings are against the suppression and oppression is the beginning of a new age in which the revolutionary youth, men and women, are paying for. Thank you. My name is Abdullah Sliman Al Bayya from the village of Kufr Malik. I was born 25th of July 1932. So I consider myself a history myself, starting 1948 until now. A human being is considered a past, present, and future. Those who don't have past don't have a present or future. Our Arab history says that Umar ibn Khattab and Abu Bakr, these are the caliphs, when they took to power, Abu Bakr said, I, I was put as I was appointed as a ruler, then but I am not the best among you. So if I do anything wrong, stop me. And Omar said, if you say anything wrong I do, then you can rectify me with your swords. So this is a recognition of the right of people to hold rulers accountable. But unfortunately, this position has come to an end long ago, and still so far is still suspended so far and marginalized. The European peoples have jumped a leap ahead. Mr. Abdullah, Mr. Abdullah. No. In Europe, the people extracted their right to hold rulers accountable, and but we as Arabs. No. Well, he says that I don't hear you. I don't hear you because I am old. No. Well, he says that